Okay, we're back this morning we're taking a look at requirement 1 of Pa8-3, which is asking for budgeted cash receipts. So let's take a look at that. Unfortunately, the numbers for Pa8-3 are different. It's the same problem as Pa8-1, but the numbers are different, so we can't use the information we used for the previous problem, 8-1. We need to use these numbers for 8-3. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to use my same worksheet that I used for 8-1 and just continue on. I think we're looking at again, we're looking at budgeted cash receipts. So if we take a look at the problem, the first part of the problem was talking about making the product. If we go down past expected unit sales, we'll use some of this information in coming up with our budgeted cash receipts. But if we take a look at the last part of the problem, Iguana Inc. had $11,100 cash on hand at April 1st. Of its sales, 80% is in cash, which means 20% is on credit. 50% is collected during the month of the sale. So that's 50% of the 20% credit sales. And then 50% of the 20% credit sales is collected in the month following the sale. Okay, so let's schedule this information out. Okay, so let's start with expected unit sales, which are frames, and I believe we're looking at the same 3-month period. Yeah, April, May, and June, same, which is the second quarter. So our expected unit sales for the 3-month period are 280, 330, and 430. And let's put a total there. And then our selling price in this problem is $25. So we have a unit selling price $25. So we have budgeted sales. So we would take expected unit sales times selling price. Okay, and what I'll do here is I'll just use a different total as a check. Okay. And these are all numbers, so let's format those as numbers, currency rather. Okay, so that's our budgeted sales. Now, of our budgeted sales, 80% of our budgeted sales represent cash sales. So if we take our sales multiplied by 0.8, that should be the amount of cash sales collected. And again, let's show a check figure over there on the right. And then our collection of sales credit, %20, and we'll have a two-step calculation here because half of the credit sales is collected in the month of sale. Half of the credits, let's get that again. Okay, of its sales, 80% are cash. Of the credit sales, 50% is collected during the month of the sale, and 50% is collected during the month following the sale. Okay, so let's take a look at collections of current month credit sales, and that's 20% times 50%. Okay, so if we take our sales and multiply by 0.20 and then multiply by 0.50, that's 700, and we should be able to do that continuous calculation. I'm pretty sure that'll work. And then we have collections of prior month credit sales. 20% times 50%. So the trick here is to get the prior month. So let's move this over a bit so we can put March in here. And we're also gonna need July. Oh, will we need July? No, we shouldn't need July because we are collecting prior month credit sales. So our prior month credit unit sales is 290. And by the way, I just realized that I formatted this as currency, but these are not currency numbers. These are unit numbers. So these should be formatted as numbers. Okay. This is the same. And this formula should be the same. So that would be budgeted sales for March. And so our collection of March credit sales, this would be plus sales times 20% times 50%. Okay. So that's B96. Let's see what happens when we calculate that C96. So in May we're collecting 50% of April credit sales, and in June we're collecting 50% of May credit sales. Okay. And our total should be the total of April, May, and June. Let's see, am I missing anything here? Budgeted cash receipts. Budgeted cash receipts. So again, we have 80% of sales are cash, 20% of sales are credit. Of the credit sales, 50% is collected in the month of the sale, and 50% is collected in the month prior. I'm sorry, 50% from the month prior is collected in the current month. Okay, so let's take a look at that. We have 80% of current month sales, 80% of current month sales, 80% of current month sales, and that's a total. Then we have current month sales times 20% times half. That's collections of current month's credit sales. Current month sales times 20% times half. Current month sales times 20% times half. That's that total. And then we also have prior month's sales. So we have March up here. March is cell B96. So this is B96 times 20% times half. And then we have C96, which is April sales times 20% times half collected in May. And then we have D96, which is May sales times 20% times 50% collected in June, and a total. So let's see if these totals are going to work for us. And let's run that check. Okay, so these are all dollar amounts. And these should be the amounts that we want to enter in our problem here. So why don't we pull that up? 7025 Pa8-3 oops, 8125 and 105. Oops. For a total of 25,650. 25,650. And like we always do, let's check our my work. and check my work is okay. So I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to process this short video on requirement 1 of Pa8-3, and I'll get this sent off to that student that is stuck on this requirement 1. Okay, thanks a lot, and see you again soon. Okay, I'm gonna pick up where I left off yesterday on Pa8-3 requirement 1. I got a couple of calls about requirements 2 and 3, and so I worked on it early this morning. I didn't record it, and so I got the solution all done, and I'll try to spend a little bit of time going through it. So first of all, let me go back to the problem and open it up. So this is the problem that I worked on yesterday for Pa8-3 requirement 1. It's the same problem as Pa8-1. However, what makes it more challenging and a lot more time consuming is that the numbers in this problem are all different from the first problem. So essentially, you got to redo all of the work, or most of the work that was already done for Pa8-1. Although you're coming up with different information, the information in this case for the cash budget is essentially working off of the information that was developed yesterday. I'm sorry, was developed in the previous problem, Pa8-1, for sales and production numbers, because cash receipts are basically dependent on sales information, and cash payments are primarily dependent on production information. So one builds off of the other, and that's basically how it works in any business. You need to be able to budget sales, budget production, or purchases, as the case may be, and ultimately from sales you need to be able to budget cash receipts, and from either production or purchases you need to be able to budget cash payments, with the objective being that you can maintain a cash balance sufficient to keep your business going and moving forward. Anyway, with that said, let's see if we can kind of shorten this presentation a little bit. So what we did yesterday in the first part of this video was work on budgeted cash receipts, and so I basically put that information here on an Excel spreadsheet, and now again, Pa8-3, we're working it with we're working in cash. This is a cash budget problem, but the information builds off of sales for cash receipts and production for cash payments. So starting with our expected unit sales that's given in the problem, and I have here scheduled March through June, because we're looking at our main period of focus is April, May, and June, but because of some of the information presented, we may have to either go back into the previous month, which would be March, or in some cases we may have to move into the next month, which would be July. So in this case, where we're coming up with budgeted cash receipts, we had to go back into March, since the cash receipts for April, as an example, if we just focused on April, the cash receipts would be based on the projected unit sales times the projected unit selling price to give projected or budgeted sales in total. However, cash collections, as is normally the case, is a little different from sales, unless all of your sales are 100% cash. In that case, sales equals cash receipts, but it's not normally like that. In this case, 80% of our sales is cash sales, so that's this amount. 80% of 7,000 is 5,600. And then of the remaining 20%, which are our credit sales, 50% of those credit sales are from the current month. So 7,000 times 20% times a half is $700. And the remaining 50% of credit sale collections comes from the previous month. So that's why we had to go back into March to calculate March budgeted sales, from which we can calculate 20% of that amount as credit sales, and so 50% of that will be collected in the current month, which is April. So our cash receipts for April is comprised of cash sales and collection of credit sales from this month plus collection of credit sales from last month, 7,025. And that's the amount that we had inputted into our problem. And the check my work showed that we were okay on that. Okay, so I worked through this in detail in the first part of this video, so I'm not going to repeat it. Now, for the next part of the problem, requirement 2, what it's asking for is budgeted cash payments. Now, this is a one-liner in terms of inputting the answer, but in terms of the calculation, it is substantially longer. And so what I did was I highlighted in gray that portion of the work here that relates to budgeted cash receipts, the first requirement for problem 8.3. And then in blue, I'm highlighting the work, the calculations that need to be run through for the second requirement, budgeted cash payments. And as you can see, it's quite a bit more than what we did for the first requirement. So let's take a look at it. We start out again with expected unit sales. Now this is right out of the problem, and all I'm doing here is I'm highlighting the 3 months that we are focused on in terms of coming up with the answer. Now, for this part of the problem, where we are coming up with budgeted production for the 3 months, budgeted cost of raw material purchases, budgeted cost of direct labor, budgeted manufacturing overhead, and budgeted selling and administrative expenses, the calculations we go through to come up with this information is exactly what we did in coming up with that information in problem Pa8-1. Okay, I want to repeat that. We need to repeat the calculations in this area, in these areas. Budgeted production, budgeted cost of raw material purchases, budgeted cost of direct labor, budgeted manufacturing overhead, and budgeted selling and administrative expenses. We need to repeat that those same calculations for problem Pa8-3 in coming up with budgeted cash payments, because cash payments come off of or are based on expenses and costs. Okay, cash receipts are based on projected sales or revenues, whereas cash payments are based on projected expenses and costs. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of those calculations again, just to save a little bit of time in getting this video updated and processed. What I did do is I highlighted the production data for April, May, and June that starts out in this calculation, where we adjust for 40% of next month's sales and 40% of the current month's sales, just as we did in problem 8-1, to come up with budgeted production for April, May, and June. And those numbers are the starting points, as you can see, for each of the subsequent calculations, each of the next three subsequent calculations. So in coming up with budgeted cost of raw material purchases, we start with budgeted production. We apply the number of linear feet required for each unit to come up with the total linear feet footage required for each month. In this case, 1,200 linear feet of material required for April. And then we adjust for production inventory requirements. We add 30% of next month's production, and we subtract 30% of this month's production, essentially our beginning inventory, and the 444 is our ending inventory. And we add our ending inventory and we back out our beginning inventory. So when we add these three numbers up, our total is 1,284 budgeted linear feet, to which we apply the cost per linear foot of $2 to come up with our budgeted cost of raw material purchases. And we do that for 3 months. Now, in doing so, for the month of June, since we are subtracting out, since we are adding in 30% of next month's production, we need to also calculate next month's production, which would be for July. So this this $510 is 30% of $1,700. So we have budgeted raw material purchases. The next item is for budgeted direct labor, and again we start with our budgeted production. We apply the fraction of hours required for each unit, in this case 30 minutes or half an hour, So for production of 300 units at a half an hour per unit, the hours required are 150 hours. The direct labor cost per hour is 11. So if we multiply 150 times 11, the budgeted direct labor cost for April is $16.50. And again, we do it for the 3 months. And then for our budgeted overhead, again, we start with budgeted production. So for April, our budgeted production is 300 units. Our variable manufacturing overhead cost per unit is 60 cents. So our variable overhead cost per month for the month of April is 180. That's 300 times 60 cents a unit, $180. And then we added our fixed manufacturing overhead cost per month, which is given in the problem, $600. And that gives us our budgeted manufacturing overhead, which includes both variable and fixed. So $780 is the budgeted manufacturing overhead for the month of April. And so we do that for May and June. Now, when we get down to budgeted selling and administrative expenses, we're not using the budget number. I'm sorry, we're not using the production number to estimate or budget selling and administrative expenses. We use the sales number. So we go back to that information given in the problem. Sales for April 280, May 330, June 430, and that's the number. Those are the numbers we use for this calculation for budgeted selling and administrative expenses. So budgeted sales per month for the month of April is 280. Budgeted expenses per selling and administrative expenses per unit is 50 cents. This is given in the problem. So we multiply 280 times 50 cents per unit. That gives us $140 budgeted variable selling and administrative expense. I just noticed that this is not per unit. This is per month. Yeah, per month. Okay. So this is budgeted variable selling and administrative expense per month, to which we add budgeted fixed selling and administrative expense per month. This is also given in the problem. And so we add the two to come up with the total selling and administrative expenses per month for April. And we do the same for May and June. So now we have the cost and expense information from which we can calculate budgeted cash payments. So we start out with budgeted raw material purchases. That's the first calculation up here. Budgeted raw material purchases, $25.68 in April. So that's these three numbers. And then we need to factor in our raw material purchases to maintain our desired inventory. We need to factor in the payment information. So 80%, and this information is also given in the problem here. Of its sales, 80, no, that's not what I'm looking at here. Here we go. Of raw material purchases, 80% is paid for during the month purchased. 20% is paid in the following month. Okay, so we need to factor that information in here. So for cash payments of our raw material purchases, 80% of the current month's purchases is paid for this month, and 20% is also being paid from the previous month. So in this case I have $400, and that's from March purchases of $2,000, and that information was given in the problem. So we got 80% of this month plus 20% of the previous month, and so that calculation is repeated for May. 80% of May purchases plus 20% of April purchases. And for June, 80% of June purchases plus 20% of May purchases. So we have calculated or shown the 80% payment and the 20% payment for material purchases. To that we add our direct labor, and our direct labor is coming off of our schedule that we did above for direct labor, $16.50 for April. So there's our direct labor amounts. And then we add our manufacturing overhead, which is coming from the schedule above. So $780 for April overhead. That's here. Now, in terms of overhead and cash paid, we need to remember that overhead includes depreciation, and depreciation is given here. It says all other operating costs paid during the month incurred here. Monthly fixed manufacturing overhead includes $180 in depreciation. So what that means is when we show our manufacturing overhead amounts as potential cash payments, we need to back out depreciation, which is a non-cash expense, and that's $180 per month. And then finally we add in our selling and administrative expenses, and again calculated above. So April's was $840. So there's our three selling and administrative expense amounts. And we're not totally done yet. We have one more item which is given in the problem, and it says during April Iguana plans to pay $3,300 for a piece of equipment. So we need to show that as a cash payment for April. Purchase of equipment, $3,300. And then if we add all of those payments, the raw material purchases, which is in two parts, 80% and 20%, the direct labor, the manufacturing overhead adjusted for depreciation, the selling and administrative expenses, and the purchase of equipment, our total budgeted cash payment amounts are these three numbers, 8840.40. And so let me show you those numbers here. And it says, notice, do not round your intermediate calculations, round final answers to 2 decimal places. So we need to show a cents if we have it. And so we're showing that here, 8844.40. 651960 and 721060 for a total of 22,574.60. And if we check my work, and I've already done this, so I know that it is correct. And then finally, putting the cash budget together. So basically, when we summarize it, that's what number 3 is asking for. What we start out with, what we expect to receive, budgeted cash receipts, less what we expect to pay, budgeted cash payments. And so if we add these 3 amounts, we come up with a preliminary cash balance. And then it says, assume the company can borrow increments of $1,000 to maintain a minimum cash balance of $10,000. So in this case for April, since our preliminary cash balance is under $10,000, we need to show cash borrowed of $1,000 since we're working with minimum increments of $1,000. And so our ending cash balance at the end of April would be 10,280.60, which carries forward to May. And then we fill in May budgeted cash receipts, subtract May cash payments, calculate the preliminary cash balance, and now we can see that we're at 11,886. So we are over 10,000 in an amount sufficient that allows us to repay that $1,000 that we borrowed for April. So we can repay it, show it as a negative amount. And our ending cash balance then would be 10,866, which carries forward to June. We add our budgeted cash receipts, subtract our budgeted cash payments, calculate our preliminary cash balance. We're okay. We're at least at 10. No borrowing necessary. And we end at 14,175. Our summary is a little tricky. This is the second quarter total, so we actually start with our April 1st balance. Then we add in the 3 months worth of receipts. We subtract out the 3 months worth of payments. We calculate the preliminary balance by adding down, and that becomes our final balance at the end of the second quarter, which is the same balance as at the end of June, the last month of the quarter. And so finally, when we check that, we can see that we're okay. Now, I did this pretty quickly. It took me, I guess, about an hour to work through all of the calculations here on the Excel spreadsheet, keeping in mind that these are the same calculations for budgeted cost of raw material purchases, budgeted direct labor cost, budgeted manufacturing overhead, and budgeted selling and administrative expenses. These are the same calculations that we did in problem 8-1 in coming up with those numbers. Budgeted cost of raw material purchases, budgeted direct labor costs, budgeted manufacturing overhead, and budgeted selling and administrative expenses. Except it was for a different problem, and the numbers that we had to use were different in 8-1 compared to 8-3, but the calculations were done the same way. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I think it would be helpful if you had this worksheet information. If you want to request for me to send you this worksheet information, I think I can do that. Let me know. This problem was due on Sunday, If you have any concerns or requests about completing this problem, maybe you can let me know by email. So I will close it up here and process it and get it posted and sent out to those students that requested it. All right, thanks a lot, and we'll be back sometime probably for other problem work. Thanks a lot.